Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Archaeological Research Facility of UC Berkeley's Brown Bag for this week. We've got a very exciting talk for you today. First, I'm going to give a quick intro and a couple of announcements. My name is Jordan Brown. I'm a grad student here and one of our co-coordinators for the Brown Bag series this semester. Just wanted to plug a couple of things for the ARF community very quickly. One, there will be another talk following the one we have today immediately at 1 p.m. This is for the welfare of the whole people, heritage stewardship, and Indigenous and Black communities. I will post the link for that. You can find it through the Berkeley website as well. Then I also wanted to say that we have our last brown bag of the semester next week from Meg Conkey and Ruth Tringham for, in Meg's own words, something strange. So folks, come on out for that. I'm sure it'll be a lot of fun and a lot of interesting things to think about. So with that, I want to recognize that the Archaeological Research Facility recognizes that Berkeley sits on the territory of Huichin, the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo Ohlone, the successors of the historic and sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people. We recognize that every member of the Berkeley community has and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold the University of California, Berkeley more accountable to the needs of American, Indian, and Indigenous peoples. So for this week's talk, I will leave the introduction to our very own Meg Conkey here to introduce our speaker, who is a colleague of hers, and they have worked closely together. So over to you, Meg.
Great, thanks so much, Jordan. And it is indeed a pleasure to be able to introduce one of our former Berkeley PhD students, Dr. Kathleen Sterling, who is an associate professor at Binghamton University in upstate New York. Her research has been centered on the French Pyrenees, which, in case you don't know where they are, they're right behind me on the screen. And she is a co-director with me and Sébastien Lacombe on an open-air excavation project called Peyre Blanque, an open-air late Paleolithic site. Kath has been working with things Paleolithic for a long time, starting from her BA degree at Harvard, where she worked for an honors thesis on lithic materials from the site of Scar-Keel with Ofer Bar Yosef. She did a PhD here at Berkeley using an apprenticeship approach to the understanding of lithic manufacture from another Upper Paleolithic site, this one in the Archaeology region, right behind me. She has an amazing array of specialties that she's published on, ranging from lithic technology, learning and identity. She's worked on communities of practice, landscape archaeology, Black feminist theory, which is what we'll hear about today, hunting and gathering groups, gender and feminist science, and has in particular been very involved now in the way in which equal opportunity exists or does not in anthropology and science in general, and particularly the ways in which this has an impact on knowledge production, which is why today we're really delighted to have her talk about a really important and even increasingly relevant topic, namely, what is Black feminist theory? What are its implications? And what does it have to offer archaeology? So Kathy, take it away.
Thank you. I'm going to just start my screen sharing here. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's wonderful to speak to the Berkeley community. Again, it's been a while, and I really look forward to the day when we can do this in person. So I'm speaking to you today from the traditional unceded lands of the Haudenosaunee and Onondaga peoples, and as a descendant of both a captive African woman and the man who enslaved her on Taino land. So it's a complicated history, but it does form part of my standpoint and the context of my thinking. So today I'm going to talk about some of the ideas and approaches of Black feminist theory and what that can bring to archaeology, primarily focusing on academic archaeology because that is my area of specialty, but with the encouragement that these ideas can be put into practice in other contexts as well. Archaeological practice and theory are tightly intertwined, but today I'm going to pick them apart a little bit while recognizing that they remain intertwined to show where there are some gaps that could be filled through Black feminist approaches. And some of these gaps, lacunae, holes even, are not always obvious until we start picking at them. So I'm going to begin with a brief history and description of what Black feminism is. Then I'll discuss multiple aspects of academic archaeological practice and provide really one example of how Black feminist theory might be applied to archaeological contexts that goes beyond what we might expect, that is, in contexts that do not actually have Black women as we recognize them today. So Black feminism goes back at least as far as mainstream or white feminism, even if it was not always explicitly defined as something different. In this image, you can see on the left a group of Black suffragists who were very important to the movement for women's suffrage, even if they would not really effectively receive the franchise until the 1960s. And on the right, a newly unveiled sculpture in Central Park honoring the suffragist movement and featuring Sojourner Truth, Susan B. Anthony, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, which frankly I have some difficulty imagining this particular tableau with Truth seated at the table with Stanton and Anthony standing. But this also represents the first statue of real women in Central Park, which is filled with statuary. Previous to this, the other representations of women in Central Park were all fictional, like Alice in Wonderland. During the suffragist movement, Black women's labor and intellect were very much useful and very much used. But Black women had to march in the back. Indeed, some of the arguments of the mainstream suffrage movement were explicitly racist, appealing to white men to open the franchise to white women, rather than allow Black men to have the franchise before they did. In the 1960s, as civil rights and independence movements became bigger and more vocal all over the world, again, Black women's labor and intellect were used. But women in the movement were very much subject to sexism. Whatever the political movement, Black women have been told over time to put others' needs before their own. during the civil rights movement, there was the explicit appeal not to air the dirty laundry of misogyny, or in this case, misogynoir, in front of everyone, meaning white people, in order to not harm the larger goals of the civil rights and independence movements. I should warn people that some of the images I have are racist in this slideshow, and there is one slide that has human remains in it, and I will let you know ahead of time. I don't know who the remains belong to. They're in the background of the image, but because I cannot say that they are not casts or replicas rather than actual human remains, and that I cannot attribute those remains to a given cultural group. I just want to make sure that you know that in advance. So first, the racist images. So stereotypes were very powerful in keeping Black women in their place. You may recognize Mammy, Sapphire, and Jezebel across the top. These were shameful images meant to control Black women. And you may also recognize the strong or sassy Black woman, and of course the angry Black woman, all either to be avoided or to prevent Black women from expressing themselves as complicated, complex, emotional, messy, real human people. So Black feminism arises from the recognition that Black women experience discrimination that is both racist and heterosexist at the same time, as well as ableist and classist. It recognizes, while there are commonalities of oppressions, the experiences of Black women in majority white spaces is a particular experience. We see this in the activism of Anna Julia Cooper, Sojourner Truth, and the Combahee River Collective, among many others. Like mainstream feminism and civil rights activism, Black feminism began as political action, and this remains foundational to Black feminist theory, even applied in academic contexts. Connecting this activism through time and space is the idea that all people will be free when Black women are free. This is part of the concept of intersectionality, a term coined by the legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989 as a reaction against the argument that if racism were eliminated under the law, that everyone would receive equal treatment. Crenshaw argued that not only could racism not be legislated away, but that Black women had a unique experience in the legal system because of their intersecting identities as Black and woman. In cases of discrimination, the system was only equipped to handle one of these at any given time, when both were operative at the same time to form new and different forms of oppression. I'd be happy to go into some of this in more detail in the Q&A later, but I think at this point, the concept of intersectionality is at once very familiar. Although the term was coined in 1989, I would say that it's really within the past 5 or so years that it has escaped to the mainstream, if you will. But its meaning, its interpretation, understanding in popular culture is not always what Crenshaw had in mind. Like mainstream feminism and civil rights activism, Black feminism has also turned its sights to multiple areas of knowledge production. These scholars have mostly focused on fields such as sociology, philosophy, literature, and law, but we do also have a foothold in anthropology and archaeology, although it remains incredibly small. This comparatively small amount of scholarship in Black feminist theory as applied to anthropology and archaeology is a symptom of an important set of problems in our discipline that we must address both for equity, but also for just doing better research. Some of these problems are also endemic to academia, but there are some that are very specific to the history and present of anthropology. The systematic racism and sexism of Western institutions is no less present in academia than anywhere else, despite our ideologies of meritocracy, open inquiry, and following the evidence wherever it leads. As American academics, we are still products of a society that, until this summer, had a majority that did not recognize that Blacks still experienced discrimination in the United States and had fewer opportunities. Non-white scholars still form a disproportionately small percentage of academic faculties, and they tend to be concentrated, you might almost say ghettoized, in certain disciplines, such as African American studies, ethnic studies, women's studies, but not in some of the more prestigious fields such as economics, philosophy, or indeed anthropology. There's also a great gender imbalance in academia. That wasn't the one yet, sorry. With women forming less than half of the faculty, despite receiving more than half of degrees in many fields. And women tend to be concentrated at lower ranks than their male counterparts are. The pay disparities between the humanities and physical sciences, with the social sciences nestled in between, also tells you everything that you need to know about their relative value in academia. We can't depend on universities and colleges to diversify the faculty at large or our disciplines. They will only do what is required of them. So this is hard work that we must do within our disciplines, within our departments. But this work is typically not rewarded by our tenure and promotion system. At any rate, diversity and inclusion are not enough. This is an incredibly low bar that is meaningless without equity. So it is the next slide that has human remains in the background. So most of us are aware of the racist history of anthropological scholarship and its role in scientific racism. We like to highlight Franz Boas as a relatively early example of anthropology's role in fighting scientific racism, but how many of us are familiar with the work of William Montague Cobb, seen on the right here, who was the first Black American to receive a PhD in biological anthropology in 1932. Cobb's work was anti-racist. It was, back in the 1930s, demonstrating that race did not have a biological basis and that scientific racism was bunk. He was also a president of AAPA, the leading academic organization in biological anthropology, but his work is much less well known than that of Boas. I have an idea that it might actually be a bit embarrassing for academics to cite Cobb's work now, since he was saying 80 years ago some of the things that we're saying now, and that back in the 1930s, there wasn't an audience for this work. The long sexist history of our discipline gets less attention until more recent parts of our history. And this might be in part because of the great fame of people like Margaret Mead. But it also might be part of a false evolutionary narrative that crops up both in anthropology in the ways that we interpret the past, but more broadly in popular understandings of how history unfolds and how the world works. We believe that the present is the least sexist period in human history, the least racist as well, and that this is a result of a long chain of progress unfolding over time that is facilitated by a more enlightened outlook and better technology that frees us from our biological imperatives. Man the hunter is not an objective fact of our evolutionary past. He's the logical result of centuries of beliefs about gender given an anthropological imprimatur. It takes a lot to chip at this model. The image on the right you may have seen recently in a lot of publications highlighting recent work about a female burial in particular that had hunting tools associated with it. And you can ask, what exactly we mean by hunting tools. But then the study that went on to find that nearly half of the burials that where the sex of the remains could be determined also had so-called hunting weapons associated with them, and that maybe this would be enough to question the concept of man the hunter, or at least of man the big game hunter. Even with this evidence, I can tell you that not everybody was convinced. So given this history, we might well stop asking why anthropology has trouble attracting minority scholars, since so much of the knowledge production and climate of academia seem hostile and resistant to our presence. The history of the discipline also shows us, however, that changes in who produces knowledge leads to changes in what kinds of knowledge are produced. This isn't automatic. The values of white, cisgender, heterosexual, middle-class men have been rendered as valueless, have been made invisible to broader society, not just to the people who inhabit those categories. So any other perspective is deemed to be value-laden by default. And the changes in what kinds of questions we could ask about the evidence we recover, what kinds of evidence we can admit as being legitimate evidence, and what kinds of results could come from this process is a really long and difficult thing to change. This is an area where double consciousness comes in handy. So who is considered a legitimate producer of knowledge? This depends in part on the research area. We are not particularly concerned about women who are interested in studying gender. Although it is better if they are studying women's gender or genderqueer people, again, because men have been rendered as not cultural in this way, that this is natural. These subjects are also less valued by the power structure, so there's less threat to studying them. But also because they are less studied, there is less prestige from the work. There's less, there are fewer citations. There's less to build off of. The prestige of the subject area rises primarily when it gains attention from the people who have more prestige. Likewise, non-white researchers may study race, especially if they study their own race. But if they are not white, their studies of race are less interesting to the power structure. And studying the white race and the concepts of whiteness from the perspective of a non-white person is very threatening. So the prestige of this area too will rise with attention from the power structure. So we have an example here of a legitimate producer of knowledge, of somebody who is objective, reliable, and has authority. Of course, this is also somebody who is completely fictional. This leads us to the problem of me-search, or the paradox, really, of me-search. If somebody who does not occupy a place of power in the hierarchy studies a subject with which they identify, this is not threatening, but it's also not seen as objective because the person has a stake in the outcomes of the study, and they are not objective because they can never truly be objective. So there's less value in this. However, if you aren't doing research, me-search, you are a threat to the broader power structures. White men can never do me-search. They only ever do research. So this has not been too much of an issue for non-white archaeologists, since most of us were drawn to archaeology in order to build knowledge about our own communities or communities that we identify with, even if we are not members of those communities. The irony of this is that you could have Black researchers from, the northeastern United States, for example, studying archaeological subjects in the southeastern United States, or you could have African Americans doing archaeological research in the Caribbean or on the African continent, and they are seen as staying in their lane in a way that, say, a Black New Yorker working on a Revolutionary War site an hour's drive away is not seen as keeping to their own interests. Besides myself, I know only one other Black American archaeologist who works in prehistoric Europe. But our presence upsets the status quo. Our double consciousness renders visible the positionality of our white colleagues. We also consider different forms of evidence of knowledge differently, depending on the producer of that knowledge and the materiality of it. Historically, the testimony of Blacks, women, and children held little to no value in this country. Oral witness was seen as dispositive when applied to people on a lower social rung. And in this case, I'm particularly referring to legal testimony. So white men's courtroom testimony was seen as the gold standard. And white women could testify against Blacks and Native Americans. Better than testimony, however, is what we consider to be hard evidence in the form of photographs, videos, or written history. These have never been objective. Digital technologies make photo and video manipulation easier, and people are now more aware of it than they may have been in the past. But this is not a new thing. Photos and videos are always framed by the person making decisions about what to center, what to omit, and then you don't just simply print a photograph from film after you develop the film. You treat the film, you might change exposures of the paper, etc. So that has never been objective. We also say that history is written by the winners, which acknowledges the fact that it is incomplete and biased. But how often do we go so far as to recognize that sometimes the written word is actually lies, or that we might not be able to properly interpret that history because we are too far removed from it? Archaeological evidence is precarious in this way, since while it's material and tangible, it is also typically ambiguous. We prefer evidence that we can interpret with our own senses. And a good example of this is the video of George Floyd's murder this summer, which was the tipping point at the beginning of our pandemic summer, when people could really pay attention and think about the evidence. And perhaps, we just needed this many videos before it could be accepted. Decades of accounts of lynching, complete with photos, were not enough evidence. Besides, that was so long ago. The bodies of Trayvon Martin, Renisha McBride, Philando Castile, and Sandra Bland were not enough. There's always a counter narrative of fear, ideas about crimes that they may have committed or would have committed, or the bad decisions that these people made to explain away why a white man had killed a Black person. Maybe in this case, it's the length of the video, the callousness of the police officer, the familiar echo of the words of Eric Gardner, "I can't breathe." Maybe this was enough to finally convince a majority of Americans that this was part of a terrible and long-standing pattern. Still, at its peak, slightly more than 50% of white Americans approved of Black Lives Matter, a percentage that has been falling since June. What does this have to do with archaeology, you may ask? Inconvenient evidence is not accepted as easily, if ever. The quantity and nature of data that is needed to dislodge our preconceived ideas may not even exist, or it may not exist yet. An example, the fact that Thomas Jefferson fathered at least some of Sally Hemings' children seemed obvious to me and to many others for a long time. Still, many others did not accept this because there was no acceptable evidence, or at least no evidence that they were willing to accept. Jefferson never wrote that this happened, as if he would have. And the only histories that supported this were passed down orally among Blacks, and that's hardly reliable. No artifactual evidence existed, whatever that might have looked like. The most bizarre argument, in my opinion, was that Jefferson wouldn't have done that. I'm not sure if that means that he was too racist for intercourse with a Black woman he owned, or too morally upstanding to rape someone he enslaved. But eventually, DNA evidence, which is an acceptable form of evidence, confirmed what many of us already knew. I deliberately say that we knew this and not that we believed it, because this evidence was legitimate. So, how can Black feminist thought change archaeology for the better? Let's begin with some overlapping areas of archaeological practice: critical pedagogy, public engagement, and ethical epistemology. Critical pedagogy has both elements of the remedial and the progressive. This is an image of our community archaeology program, which works with local community members for about a week or so in the summer. It's incredibly popular and has really gotten a lot of visibility and support for archaeology in this community. All Americans need greater exposure to the contributions of non-white and non-male people all over the world and through time. This includes exposing students to non-white, non-male researchers as experts. So not just during the special interest weeks of the syllabus, but across the board. So I recommend inviting guest lecturers to speak about landscape archaeology or faunal analysis who don't fit the usual mold of the experts in these areas. Integrate their work into your teaching throughout the semester. An ever greater percentage of undergraduates in public universities are racial and ethnic minorities. More than half of them are women. But this is not reflected in the professors that they see around them. And they are yearning to see faculty who look like them. The last time I taught an undergraduate class about Ice Age Europe, fully a third of the class was non-white. And while I'd like to believe that this is because the subject area was of deep and abiding interest to so many people, I have to be more realistic and believe that my identity was part of this, and that I might have been the only Black professor they had in their undergraduate careers. This is a very simple and passive way to show students that archaeology can be for them too, and hopefully bring them into the discipline. We have to also empower students to challenge authority, and that includes your authority. We have to help them question their received knowledge and wisdom, support them in knowledge production, however small, from their very first archaeology class. We need to help them fight racism, sexism, or other oppressions that they encounter in the classroom. Not every student will respond to this, of course, but those who can go on to make good trouble, as John Lewis described it, no matter what path they choose to take in life. Be an activist teacher to the best of your ability and support your colleagues in this. We also need to think about the hands-on training of archaeology students. We privilege field training over lab training as being more the real work of archaeology. And most of the opportunities for field training come in the form of summer field schools. On the positive side, this has created more opportunity than was traditionally available, because anybody can apply to a field school and you don't have to have connections to learn how to excavate. However, not everyone has the money for travel, tuition, and other expenses, nor the luxury of lost wages during a summer field school. Giving more weight to lab analysis as legitimate training for grad school or a CRM career would mean that students could potentially get that experience during the academic year and paid for through their regular tuition or on a volunteer basis. Where the climate and other circumstances permit, field classes can also take place during the regular academic year. I did one in Boston, so the climate in the US permits this all over. Between the SAA, the AIA, and other organizations, there are maybe about a dozen scholarships available to minority and Native American students for field schools, which comes nowhere near meeting the need. Until last April, I was the chair of the Minority Scholarships Committee, and we received 20 applications for 4 scholarships. I'm just going to also quickly give a shout out to Meg, who has pledged to make matching donations to the Minority Scholarships Committee. So if you haven't donated, please do. If it gets up to the full amount that she's pledged, this is more than enough to cover 3 student scholarships in addition to what the SAA will pledge. Public engagement is one of the primary ways that people learn about archaeology and what it's really like, outside of the movies. So this is another area where we have to make sure that we are engaging broad publics and that we are encouraging a lot of different people to see that archaeology is for them. Also, I draw on Michael Blakey's conception of ethical epistemology, which is most familiar in his work at the African Burial Ground in New York City. I think I'm running short on time, so I'm not going to go into the details of the project, but Blakey made a very strong effort to involve the community and to see them as stakeholders, even without any biological connection to the people who were buried there. And this was at a point when the ink on NAGPRA was barely dry. There's no legal requirement for this. There still is no legal requirement for it. Blakey's ethical epistemology means that he accepts that archaeologists have to accept no for an answer from a stakeholder community. When the community withdraws its consent, you have to stop what you're doing. Archaeology is for the living and not for the dead. So if your work is harming living people, your ethical obligation is to do something about that. I have a couple of other examples of ethical epistemology, but I'm going to skip over them and emphasize that citation practices are also part of this, and they are also political. Citation statistics can be used to deny scholars tenure or promotion in a way that seems neutral and based on merit. Although when you consider if people are doing innovative work, it might take a while for the discipline to catch up. The contrary is true as well. It's easy enough to remove people from the syllabus when they have had their unethical or illegal behavior exposed. But I would also argue that we should stop citing their research and academic work. There are usually alternatives to citing these people if we are willing to look for them. And there are often people who don't get cited as often. And if there are not, then we may need to borrow the concept of the fruit of the poison tree from the law. Evidence that is obtained by illegal or unethical means cannot be used. And this might mean that the entire case collapses. Again, if the work we do ignores or legitimates harm to living people, we must not pursue it. I'm going to skip this. This is a bill that has been sitting in the House for over a year to protect African American burials. So to close, talking a bit about interpretation. Right now, this is about the extent of publications in archaeology that explicitly use a Black feminist approach. The first publication is from 2001. The second from 2011, the third from 2015. The first two focus on historical archaeology, particularly on Black women. I'm not a historical archaeologist, so I'm not going to talk about this work, but I'm going to encourage you to go and read it for yourself. But I think that a lot of people may wonder how this approach can be applied to interpretation beyond context where you have what we recognize as Black women. This is something that I did in my article, thinking about Neanderthals and their racial position. Now, we have no idea what past people thought about race, but we do have a problem of naturalizing race and gender through archaeology, and then appealing to archaeology to justify present conditions. And this is why it is so important to make sure that the way we interpret archaeological evidence is not doing unnecessary harm to living people. If we are naturalizing race and sexism through our work, going to the deep past, this is doing harm to living people. If we have enough time, I can talk about the specifics of how I looked at human Neanderthal relations in the Ice Age, applying Black feminist theory. But going to skip over my Neanderthals here and go to my last slide. And thank you very much for your attention today. Cite Black women. And I'm happy to take questions now.
Okay, Kathy, thank you so much, and gives us a lot of food for thought. Let me look and see here. I don't know if I have anybody in my chat that I've got. No questions yet. Everybody is thinking about it. So maybe I should ask you one as well. I know you didn't have as much time to elaborate on some of these issues and exactly how we can integrate this, but I'd just like you to talk a little bit more about how we make these moves away from thinking that any of these kinds of approaches, if it's called Black feminist, is it only for people who identify as Black feminist or only about Black feminist issues? Or are there ways in which some of these approaches can actually have general principles and practices to them? I think the one on what constitutes evidence obviously is a really important lesson from what you have to say. But what other kinds of things, if you're sending somebody to the field and say, well, you better read your Black feminist theory first. What could be a couple of, takeaways that a person would take going into a field anywhere in the world at any time period?
I think that a lot of people don't feel comfortable calling themselves Black feminists if they're not Black women. And I think that makes a lot of sense. But you can say that you are using Black feminist theory in the same way that you can say that you are using Indigenous archaeological approaches, even if you are not an Indigenous person. So that's one part. And I think that, what you need to do is think about the multiplicity of identity in the past, that we can't think about people's experiences just from one perspective at a time, and that perspective certainly should not be our own. But to think about how everyone has a multiplicity of identities, even if you occupy unmarked categories, this is still a standpoint, it's still a position in the world. So, thinking about, how certain classes or moieties of women might have interacted, might have resisted, might have produced, might have had technological knowledge that was theirs, might be one question that you could ask that isn't typically asked.
Right, great, good. I guess we don't have any other immediate questions as time is running out. I do see we have a greeting being sent to you by Patrice Bonafou. So we do have a wide-ranging audience, since he's in London and has been part of our field crew. Maybe you could say one thing, just again to expand on this. You and Joelle Nivens are probably the only two Black women archaeologists working in prehistory, at least in Europe. And how would you say that your Black feminist perspectives have influenced how you do that fieldwork in Europe?
Well, it didn't occur to me when I started doing archaeology in high school and then early on in my undergraduate career that I was doing anything strange by looking at Europe. But it didn't take too long for me to become very aware of my positionality as an archaeologist, as a Black woman looking at presumably white cavemen, that this was something that was seen as threatening, as possibly illegitimate, as just plain weird. I also don't think it's a coincidence that Joelle and I are both Jamaican. I was born here, she was born in Jamaica, but grew up in the US. But that our parents, our mothers in particular, grew up as members of a majority community. And that some of the values that they pass to us come from that perspective in a way that doesn't necessarily happen for a lot of Black Americans.
And lastly, if we do have a second, maybe you'd like to say a few more words, according to one of the questioners, about that work with Neanderthals.
Sure. So the Neanderthal example that I used in the 2015 paper, which I'm happy to send people copies of, focused on the fact that we now know that anatomically modern humans and Neanderthals interbred and left fertile offspring. And so that genetic legacy lives on today. But the stories that we have traditionally told about the encounters between humans and Neanderthals in Europe was one of conflict, was one of the superiority of anatomically moderns, and didn't consider the fact that Neanderthals were a very successful species, that they surely had knowledge of the landscape that they had occupied for so long, and that newcomers to this place could have found cooperation with Neanderthals more fruitful. And then the other part of this is that clearly they had intimate relationships. So if these relationships were the products of violence, I think we should assume that that these children probably would not have been very successful, that women did have some control over their fertility long before the pill or legal abortion, and that if the community as a whole, and mothers in particular, did not nourish and support these children, that they wouldn't have survived. Also, these children would have had to have grown up in communities that had anatomically modern humans in them. If they only grew up in Neanderthal groups, they wouldn't have been able to pass that genetic legacy to people living today. So why not think about women's agency in their reproductive choices, and not consider Neanderthals as the perpetually subaltern inferior group, and think of them as people with knowledge, with value. And I think it's not too far of a stretch to think about this as a culture contact situation. Even if we are talking about people who are not as close genetically as we see with modern situations of culture contact.
Well, that's a great way to extend out our understanding and knowledge of what it takes to have multiple generations succeed. It has to come from some support back then. So I think we're just about out of time. Thank you so much. It's great to hear from you. Folks, if you want to get in touch with Kathy, she's Sterling at binghamton.edu, and you can write to her or track down that 2015 paper. Thanks again, Kath, and it's great to see you back in Berkeley.
Thank you. It's good to kind of